It's based on a true podcast, the podcast devoted to the ways that Hollywood talks about true crime and real life people. As always, I am Kristen Lopez. And instead of our fearless co-host, William Bibiani, this episode, we are joined by Ticklish Business's other leading lady, femme fatale, Kimberly Pierce. Kim, how are you?
Aw, shucks. I am well. How are you?
I just hyped you as a femme fatale, and your first words were "aw, shucks."
Aw, shucks. I got to take what I can get. I like it.
Well, we are introducing you to this series with a movie that honestly has no real connection to why you're included on this, but this is what we're doing. It's our show, damn it. And we are talking about the 2003 true crime quasi John Holmes biopic, Wonderland. So when I envisioned this series, Wonderland was one of the first movies that I wanted to do, and it took a long time for us to actually get to it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is the perfect combination of the two things that LA is known for, which is sex and depravity and crime. And it's all lovingly crafted into one movie that has no interest in showing the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, but really showing what Los Angeles was like in the 1980s. It was grim, folks. There was a lot of bad stuff going down. And
but LA is known for grisly murders in the middle of the summer.
Exactly. And porn, of course. So to those listening to this series and thinking, why are we talking about this movie that has people whose names we don't know, and you're talking about the most famous name being that of a porn star? That's why I think that LA Hollywood history is so wrapped up in that intersection between crime making people famous and sex being a selling point, and it's just more overt in the porn industry. I will say, in full transparency, as I am someone who's eerily fascinated with the history of pornographic films. I'm not interested in pornographic films. I am interested in the history of them because it's an industry that we don't talk about. It's the shadow industry of people and faceless names, but it's making so much money and there's so much murder and debauchery happening. And yet it's expected because of the industry that you're in. Kim, did I just creep you out? Are you second guessing our friendship right now?
No, you are actually, this movie served to remind me. I've always had sex and gender in cinema has always been an interest of mine. And diving into this has kind of reminded me how much I've always wanted to deep dive into the history of early pornography. The names, the face, that there's so little talked about, but there's such complexity. It's just a fascinating topic.
And really, Holmes was responsible for a time, one of several people, for making porn mainstream, about as mainstream as it was ever going to get in the mid 70s into the 1980s. Regular average people, my parents will tell you, they did not watch porn, but they knew who John Holmes was, and they knew some of the movies. They knew Deep Throat, they knew Behind the Green Door and Marilyn Chambers.
Exactly.
They knew these people, but they were not people that would have been buying into the industry, but that's how ubiquitous it was. And I think Wonderland is one of those movies that really tries to embrace that. I will say, if you're looking for a book that is a fantastic not necessarily intended, oral history of the porn industry, Legs McNeil's The Other Hollywood is a fantastic, fantastic book about the history of the porn industry, including the issues with obscenity, the mob. Talks about John Holmes and some of the big names that were wrapped up in that time period. It talks about the exploitation of women. It talks a lot about all those things that you would expect. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. Shameless plug for it. But I want to get into Wonderland. It's the anniversary of the event. It took place July 1st, 1981 in Los Angeles. This is probably the only movie that overtly discusses it. I will talk about the more famous movie that kind of told the story in a second. But it's directed and written by James Cox, who not really a big name director. He had come out the year before with a film called Highway that actually had Jared Leto, Jake Gyllenhaal, and Selma Blair. And he's gone on to do 2 more movies, including his most recent, which was The Billionaire Boys Club, with 2 people whose names I'm not going to mention because they are dumpster men. So not exactly the most well-known director, but at the time this came out, it was a bit of a big deal for the independent film scene. It has Val Kilmer, Lisa Kudrow, Kate Bosworth, Dylan McDermott. Val Kilmer plays John Holmes, who is telling the story to the audience of the Wonderland Murders, also known as the 4 on the Floor murders, and his presumed possible culpability, complicity in that. You also learn about his life after his porn career had dried up, his relationship with an underage girl, played by Kate Bosworth, and his estranged wife, played by Lisa Kudrow. So I love this movie. I talk about this movie in conversation all the time. I think it's probably my favorite LA movie, one of them. I think it captures what people love about the city, but also what the city really is about, which is a lot of boredom. And unless you're in the scene in some way, you're kind of out of it and you're not really a part of it. So I think it captures a lot of the griminess of LA very expertly. But Kim, I'm assuming this was the first time watch for you.
This was. I knew a lot of I knew John Holmes was a person. I knew that he was involved in porn. And I knew that there was something that he was involved. I knew the Wonderland murders were a thing, but I didn't, and that he was somehow involved, but I really didn't have much detail beyond that. And this was a first time watch for me, and I loved it. I found this absolutely fascinating. Everything about, I loved that casting. I mean, it did feel very indie, like 2003. And I couldn't help but think how much high school me would have been into that movie. And it was probably a good thing I didn't see it when I was, 17 or however old I was then. But I thought it laid things out incredibly well.
High school me was really into this movie. I think it was early college me was really into this. I remember seeing this. This was not heavily advertised. I want to say that my introduction to this was probably seeing Kate Bosworth talk about it on Entertainment Tonight. And then I was really interested in it, but it never came to my city. And so I just vaguely noticed that it was out one day at the video store and rented it. And that's how I saw it. But you're right that it's very 2003. I think the trailer for this movie perfectly encapsulates the studio's desire to capture something, but having no idea what the movie is about. Because on the one hand, it's got all these double entendres about John Holmes's junk, but then it's got these weird stylized cutouts of the characters that trying to sell it maybe as like a Boondock Saints or a Suicide Kings, one of those very macho male like heist films of the early
Tarantino
2000s.
Almost.
Very
kind of what they're
Tarantino.
trying for Tarantino.
And yet at the same time, it looks like a Lifetime movie. I was waiting for this because we've talked about Lindsay Lohan in the Elizabeth Taylor biopic. And I talked about that trailer. And this felt a lot like a Lifetime movie trailer with all these stars where you're like, oh yeah, I could conceivably see them on this channel. It feels like they're trying to sell a TV movie.
A subject like this, they must have been struggling because, I mean, you're dealing with some incredibly taboo topics. How are you going to deal with porn with a mainstream audience? You're dealing with such an incredibly grisly murder. What cracked me up with that trailer was the sense of nostalgia that they were trying to sell. They were using these songs that we all know and we all sit there and we tap our toes to this subject to this movie that's about sex, drugs, porn, and murder.
I was watching the trailer being like, yeah, I do love this soundtrack, but I don't know what this movie is about.
I'm like, do I remember those songs even in the movie?
Yes, I do. Yeah. Well, and that's a big selling point of why I think this movie failed ultimately, is that it also wants to sell it as its biggest competitor, which was Boogie Nights.
This episode is made possible thanks to the continued support of our lovely Patreon subscribers. If you'd like another way to support us, recommend us to anyone looking for classic entertainment goodness. You can also leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you aren't yet a subscriber, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/ticklishbiz for giveaways, early access, and lots more additional bonus content.